The armory of forward operating base Falcon smelled like gun oil, steel, and the faint metallic tang of spent ammunition casings. Sergeant Marcus Webb didn't notice the smell anymore, not after 7 years of maintaining weapons in combat zones across 3 continents. To him, this scent was as familiar as his own skin, a sensory anchor that grounded him to reality whenever the chaos of war threatened to pull everything sideways. He sat on a metal workbench, hunched over his current project, an M40 sniper rifle that had been returned from the field with a worn firing pin and trigger housing that needed replacement. The morning light filtered through the reinforced windows of the armory, casting long shadows across the weapon. Webb adjusted his work lamp, ensuring he could see every microscopic detail. This was his domain, a 200-square-foot sanctuary filled with precision instruments, spare parts organized in military efficiency, and hundreds of weapons that depended entirely on his expertise to function properly. Webb's hands moved with the fluid grace of someone who had performed these exact movements 10,000 times. He inserted the new firing pin with a soft metallic click, testing the bolt action 3 times to ensure the mechanism cycled perfectly. 1, 2, 3, smooth as silk. He nodded to himself. This rifle would fire when its shooter needed it to. It would chamber rounds reliably. It would point true. It would save lives. That last part was what kept Webb going through the repetitive, unappreciated work. Around him, the armory contained a small arsenal, shelves lined with M16s, M4 carbines, and designated marksman rifles. Locked cases held pistols and specialized equipment. In the corner, a separate section contained the precision weapons, M40s, M110 semi-automatic sniper rifles, and a couple of M1 7.50 caliber weapons that required a specialist's touch. Webb maintained all of them. He knew the idiosyncrasies of every single rifle in this armory. He knew which ones had slightly tighter chambers, which ones preferred certain ammunition, which ones had stock wobble that needed shimming. The other soldiers called him Wrench behind his back. Webb had heard it whispered in the mess hall, seen it written in the duty roster once by some smart-mouth private. He'd reported it, and the soldier had received extra duty, but the nickname had stuck anyway. Most soldiers didn't understand what he did. To them, he was invisible, a functionary, a support role, someone who kept things running but wasn't part of the actual combat machinery. They didn't see themselves in him. They didn't understand that Sergeant Marcus Webb was the reason their weapons didn't jam when they needed them most. He was the reason rounds fired true when split-second accuracy meant the difference between coming home or being carried home in a flag-draped coffin. Webb didn't mind being overlooked. He'd made peace with that reality long ago. He was 41 years old, a career soldier with no wife, no kids, and no desire to pursue higher rank. He'd turned down promotion to staff sergeant 3 times. He didn't want to be anyone's supervisor. He didn't want to manage people or deal with the politics of the officer corps. He wanted to be in the armory, surrounded by machines he could understand, working with his hands, ensuring that every weapon that left this building was absolutely reliable. He set down the M40 and picked up a designated marksman rifle that needed its gas tube cleaned. The work was meditative for Webb. His mind could wander while his hands executed the necessary tasks. He thought about his daughter, Sarah, who was 15 now. He hadn't seen her in person for 14 months. Video calls happened sporadically when the base's internet connection cooperated. His ex-wife, Jennifer, had married again. Sarah called her new stepfather Dad now. Webb had made peace with that too. He was the ghost father, the voice on occasional video calls, the child support deposit that showed up on time every month. His daughter barely remembered his face in person, but that was okay. This was his life. This was his purpose. The armory door opened, and Private First Class Tyler Jackson entered carrying a rifle with a cracked rail mount. Jackson saluted, though it was unnecessary in the informality of the armory. Sergeant Webb, this one took a round hit on the left side. Gunny says it's still functional but might need structural inspection. Webb accepted the weapon, running his fingers along the damaged rail system. He nodded slowly, already assessing the damage. I'll inspect it properly. Check back tomorrow afternoon. Should be mission ready by then. Jackson nodded and left without another word. This was the nature of their interaction: efficient, professional, minimal. Outside the armory, Webb could hear the organized chaos of Forward Operating Base Falcon. Trucks rumbled as supplies were loaded. Soldiers shouted orders and acknowledgments. Helicopters droned in the distance. Something was happening, something significant. Webb had been around military bases long enough to recognize the rhythms. When the tempo accelerated like this, when there was an urgency in the air, it usually meant a major operation was being launched. He returned to his workbench and secured the rifle Jackson had brought in. He would inspect it thoroughly tonight after finishing the current batch of maintenance. That was the thing about his job. There was always more work, always another weapon that needed attention, always another soldier relying on him to keep their equipment in perfect condition. The radio mounted on the wall squawked with routine traffic: supply requests, maintenance schedules, duty roster confirmations. Webb filtered it out, concentrating on the work in front of him. He methodically worked through the M40, checking everything: the scope rings, the magazine spring tension, the trigger pull weight, the bolt face for any imperfections. This rifle would shoot under 3 inches at 300 meters, he was certain of it. He'd test-fired it personally yesterday, and the groups had been tight and centered. The afternoon wore on. Webb serviced 3 more rifles, processed maintenance logs, and requisitioned some replacement parts that should arrive with the next supply run. His world was small, contained within this armory, defined by the weapons and the routines. He had no illusions about his importance in the grand scheme of things, but he understood that wars weren't won by the flashy, charismatic soldiers who appeared in recruiting videos. Wars were won by the reliable, by the men and women who showed up every single day and did the unglamorous work that kept the machinery of combat operational. At 16:30 hours, Webb locked up the armory. He performed the security check, ensuring every weapon was properly stored, every door was sealed, every log was recorded. He didn't know that outside the gates of Fob Falcon, events were already in motion that would, within hours, pull him from this quiet sanctuary and force him to become something he'd never imagined. A man who would have to fire a weapon in anger, knowing that his own precision and knowledge were all that stood between his brothers and sisters and death itself. For now, Sergeant Marcus Webb walked back to his quarters, completely unaware that his world was about to change forever. The radio transmission that changed everything came at 18:47 hours, 30 minutes before sunset at Forward Operating Base Falcon. It was the kind of call that made everyone within earshot instantly aware that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Firebase Command, this is Reaper 1. We have a situation. Sniper Team Delta is compromised. 1 operator down, confirmed KIA. 2nd operator is wounded, unable to extract. We need immediate support. I repeat, we need immediate combat support. The voice was controlled, professional, the way soldiers sound when they're trained to stay calm under extreme pressure. But there was an undertone of desperation that transcended the radio static, a raw edge that communicated the full gravity of the situation to anyone who understood military communication. Sergeant First Class David Chen, the Firebase commander, was in the operations center when the transmission came through. He immediately initiated the emergency protocol. Within 60 seconds, every key personnel on the base received notification that a combat emergency was in progress. The base shifted into a state of controlled crisis. Medical teams prepped the field hospital. Quick reaction force soldiers began gearing up. And Captain Maria Rivera, the operations officer for Fob Falcon, began trying to solve an impossible problem. The problem was one of geography and time. Sniper Team Delta was operating 15 kilometers northeast of the base, providing overwatch for reconnaissance teams in a heavily contested area near the Afghan border. The nearest dedicated sniper support team was stationed at Fob Sharon, more than 200 kilometers away. Even with a helicopter at immediate readiness, that was a minimum 3-hour response time. By then, the wounded sniper would likely be dead from blood loss, and the entire area would be swarming with insurgent forces looking to capitalize on the American presence. Captain Rivera was 38 years old, with 12 years of military service and 6 deployments under her belt. She had dark hair pulled back in a tight military bun, sharp brown eyes that missed nothing, and a reputation for making impossible decisions under impossible circumstances. She moved through the operations center like a force of nature, collecting information, coordinating resources, and trying to find any possible solution to the crisis. "What's the status of the rescue team?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos of the operations center. "We have a quick reaction force assembling now, ma'am," Lieutenant Williams responded. "They can be ready to move out in 20 minutes, but without sniper support to suppress enemy fire in that area, sending them in would be suicide. We'd lose more people." Rivera's jaw clenched. She understood the mathematics of combat. You didn't send a rescue team into active hostile territory without fire support. It was the fastest way to turn a bad situation into a disaster, but leaving the wounded sniper to die wasn't an option either. That soldier had made the ultimate commitment, putting their life on the line for the mission. The military didn't abandon people. "What about air support?" Rivera asked. "Nearest air support is 45 minutes out," someone called from the communications console. "A-10 Warthogs, but they're coming from Forward Operating Base in Kandahar. They're already en route but won't be in position for almost an hour." An hour? The wounded sniper didn't have an hour. They had maybe 30 minutes before blood loss became fatal. Rivera's mind raced through options, each one seemingly worse than the last. She needed a sniper or a marksman who could provide overwatch for the rescue team. She needed someone who could suppress enemy fire from the ridge lines and keep the quick reaction force from being massacred. And she needed that someone right now. "What about personnel on base?" she asked, already knowing the answer but hoping someone had thought of something she'd missed. "We have no dedicated snipers at this FOB, ma'am," Williams said. "Our sniper team rotated out last month, and replacements aren't scheduled to arrive until next week." Next week might as well have been next year. Rivera stood in the center of the operations center, surrounded by maps and monitors and the controlled panic of military emergency response. She'd been in this position before, facing impossible decisions that would determine whether soldiers lived or died, but the pressure never got easier. The weight never got lighter. "Who's our best marksman on base?" she asked quietly. There was a pause. Then Sergeant First Class Chen spoke up. "Ma'am, we have several qualified marksmen, but if you're talking about someone who understands weapons at the deepest level, someone who can compensate for ballistic variables and work under pressure, there's only one person I'd consider." "Who?" Rivera didn't hesitate. "Sergeant Marcus Webb, the rifle maintainer. He's qualified expert on everything from pistols to .50 caliber weapons. More importantly, he understands the mechanics and variables better than anyone I've ever seen." Rivera's expression didn't change, but internally she was already calculating. Webb. She knew who he was, the quiet soldier who kept the weapons operational. She'd seen him around the base, always in the background, always focused on his work. She'd never given him much thought. But Chen was right. A rifle maintainer would understand ballistics, wind compensation, and weapon performance at a level that most soldiers never achieved. "Where is he?" Rivera was already moving toward the door. "Probably in the armory, ma'am. He usually works until 1900 hours." Rivera left the operations center at a near run, her mind already 3 steps ahead. She had maybe 5 minutes to convince a support soldier to become a combat soldier. 5 minutes to convince someone who'd spent his career in the background to become the focus of an entire rescue operation. The irony wasn't lost on her. They were about to make Webb the most important person on the entire base. She burst through the armory door at 18:52 hours. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the weapon racks. And there he was, Sergeant Marcus Webb, standing at his workbench, hands still moving with practiced precision as he worked on some rifle component, completely unaware that his world was about to explode. Rivera approached him directly. Her voice, when she spoke, was controlled but carried the weight of urgency. "Webb, I need to talk to you. It's important." Webb looked up, his hands stilling. Something in Rivera's expression told him this wasn't routine. She didn't waste time on preliminaries. Her next words would change his life forever. "Can you shoot?" Webb's hands froze mid-movement. His brain took a moment to process the question, not because he didn't understand the words, but because the question itself seemed disconnected from reality. "Can you shoot?" It was like asking a carpenter if he could hammer a nail. Technically true, but not the point of anything. "Ma'am," he said carefully, setting down the firing pin he'd been holding. Captain Rivera didn't repeat herself. Instead, she explained the situation in rapid-fire sentences. Sniper Team Delta compromised. 1 dead, 1 wounded. No sniper support available for at least 3 hours. A rescue team needed to extract the survivor, but they needed fire support to survive the attempt. Webb could provide that fire support. The question had been a formality. Rivera was already assuming his answer would be yes. Webb felt something shift inside his chest, a sensation like the world tilting on its axis. He'd qualified on rifles years ago, all soldiers did. He'd fired weapons on ranges, earned his expert marksman rating, and maintained his annual certifications. But those were maintenance skills, refresher courses. He hadn't actively engaged in combat marksmanship in 7 years. 7 years of garrison duty, training exercises, and weapons maintenance. 7 years of being the quiet man in the background. "Captain, I'm a maintainer," he said slowly, "not a combat." "I know what you are, Sergeant," Rivera interrupted, her voice firm. "I also know you understand weapons better than anyone on this base. Right now, that's what I need. Not a sniper. I need someone who understands ballistics, wind compensation, and how to execute a shot under pressure. Chen said you're the best qualified person we have." Webb's mouth went dry. He looked at the rifles around him, weapons he'd cleaned, maintained, and test-fired. He knew their capabilities intimately. He knew their quirks and their strengths. But knowing a weapon and trusting yourself to use it in actual combat were fundamentally different things. "How long do I have?" he asked. 20 minutes. The rescue team moves out at 19:10 hours. You need to be positioned and ready by then. 20 minutes. Webb nodded slowly, his training beginning to override his doubt. 20 minutes was workable. 20 minutes was enough time to prepare if he focused. He turned toward his weapon racks, his mind already selecting which rifle would be optimal for the mission. "I'll need the M40 in position 4, he said, his voice steadier now. "It's been test-fired and verified. I can trust it completely." "Get what you need," Rivera said. "I'm assigning Lieutenant Sarah Marcus to brief you on the target location and provide spotter support. She's a trained observer, and she'll be your contact on the ground. You'll be positioned on the base's north tower. From there, you should have clear sight lines to the engagement area." Webb nodded, already moving. He pulled the M40 from its rack, the same weapon he'd been servicing that morning. He'd replaced the firing pin on this exact rifle just hours ago. He knew its trigger pull, its zero, its ballistic profile better than he knew his own heartbeat. If he was going to do this, this was the weapon to do it with. He began the process of preparing the rifle for combat. Magazine loaded with precision ammunition he'd personally inspected. Scope remounted and verified. Sling adjusted to his preferred configuration. Each movement was deliberate, controlled, methodical. This was his wheelhouse. This was what he did every single day. The only difference was that now, instead of test firing the weapon on the range, he'd be using it against living, breathing human beings who wanted to kill American soldiers. The thought made his hands tremble slightly. He forced the tremor away through sheer force of will. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Sergeant Webb, Lieutenant Marcus, appeared in the armory doorway carrying her own gear. She was young, probably mid-20s, with the lean frame of someone who spent significant time in the field. Her eyes were sharp, focused. "I've got the latest intel on the target area. Let's talk through the engagement." Webb grabbed the rifle and a tactical pack containing ammunition, wind gauge, and range-finding equipment. Together, he and Marcus moved toward the North Tower, the sun sinking lower on the horizon. They climbed the metal stairs, the weight of the rifle and equipment growing heavier with each step, or perhaps it was just the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. At the top of the tower, Marcus spread out a map and began explaining the tactical situation. Sniper Team Delta was positioned on a hilltop approximately 820 meters from the base. Enemy forces were estimated to be concentrated on a ridge line approximately 300 meters from Delta's position. The rescue team would approach from the south, moving through heavy brush. Enemy response was expected to come from the ridge, attempting to pin down the rescue team and prevent extraction. "You're going to be our insurance policy," Marcus said. "When the rescue team moves in, they'll be vulnerable. If enemy fire pins them down, they're dead. You need to suppress that fire, make the enemy keep their heads down long enough for the extraction team to do their job." Webb studied the map, mentally calculating ranges and angles. 800 meters for the main ridge line, potentially longer for secondary positions. The engagement area was rolling terrain with heavy vegetation. Wind patterns would be variable depending on the specific position. Temperature drops would affect ballistic performance as darkness fell. "What's the current weather?" he asked. "Temperature dropping. Wind is currently 7 to 9 knots from the northwest, gusting to 12. Humidity is dropping as the sun sets." Marcus paused. "This is going to be a difficult shot, Webb, even for experienced snipers." Webb understood what she was really saying. You might miss. People might die because of your mistake. The weight of that understanding settled across his shoulders like a physical force. He assembled the rifle completely, checking and rechecking every component. Scope alignment verified. Bolt action tested. Magazine seating confirmed. The weapon was a tool, perfectly maintained and ready to function exactly as designed. The variables he couldn't control, distance, wind, enemy movement, those he'd have to account for through training and instinct. "I'll need ballistic data for the primary ridge position," Webb said. "And I'll want to observe fire patterns before I commit to shots. I don't want to waste ammunition." Marcus nodded, impressed by his methodical approach. "You sound like an actual sniper." "I'm not a sniper," Webb said quietly, settling into the firing position at the tower's firing port. "I'm a rifle maintainer who's about to make some very difficult shots." He chambered the first round and looked through the scope at the distant ridge line. Through magnified glass, the terrain became clearer, more detailed. This was real now. This was happening. In the distance, he could hear the sound of the rescue team's vehicles being prepared. He could hear the voice of command coordinating the extraction. And somewhere out there, a wounded American soldier was bleeding out, waiting for help that depended entirely on the precision and nerve of a man who'd spent the last 7 years in the background. Sergeant Marcus Webb took a long breath and began his calculations. The night deepened around forward operating base Falcon, and Sergeant Marcus Webb found himself in an unexpected position, at the center of a complex combat operation that would unfold in the darkness. The sun had completely disappeared below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of starlight and the ambient light pollution from the base's security fixtures. Webb remained in the North Tower, the M40 across his lap, his mind working through calculations that would determine whether soldiers lived or died. Lieutenant Marcus had left him with the latest intelligence briefing, weather data, and ballistic tables. She'd promised to return with updated information from command as it became available. But for now, Webb was alone with the rifle and his thoughts, which was perhaps not the best state of mind to be in when facing the enormity of what he was about to do. He disassembled the M40 completely, examining every component under the tower's tactical lighting. This wasn't necessary. He'd already verified the weapon that morning during routine maintenance, but the familiar ritual of breaking down and rebuilding the rifle helped calm his racing thoughts. His hands moved through the sequence automatically, each movement precise and methodical: field stripping, component inspection, reassembly, bolt cycling test, magazine seating verification. Everything functioned perfectly. But perfect mechanical function didn't guarantee perfect execution. That was the variable that terrified Webb. He test-fired this exact rifle at 300 meters just days ago, achieving a 3-shot group of less than 2 inches. Excellent accuracy. But combat was nothing like the range. On the range, there were no moving targets, no return fire, no adrenaline flooding your system, no tunnel vision, no the suffocating pressure of knowing that missed shots meant dead comrades. Webb loaded the magazine with 20 rounds of match-grade ammunition, each bullet inspected individually. The rounds were military specification, Federal Lake City ammunition that he'd personally verified through the entire supply chain. He knew these rounds. He knew their ballistic coefficient, their muzzle velocity when fired from this specific weapon, their behavior at different distances and environmental conditions. But knowledge and execution were different things. The tower door opened, and Staff Sergeant James Cole stepped out onto the platform. Cole was one of the few dedicated snipers who'd been stationed at FOB Falcon before the rotation. He was staying an extra 2 weeks to mentor the incoming sniper team, and his presence on the base was the only reason Webb had any hope of success. "Rivera told me the situation," Cole said without preamble, settling beside Webb at the firing port. Cole was a lean, weathered man in his mid-40s, with the particular intensity of someone who'd killed people at distances that most soldiers couldn't comprehend. "You're going to do fine." "How can you possibly know that?" Webb asked, not looking away from the rifle he was working on. Cole was quiet for a moment. "Because I've trained hundreds of soldiers on marksmanship, and I can tell within 30 seconds of watching someone handle a weapon whether they have the discipline for it. You have discipline, Webb. That's the foundational skill. Everything else can be learned or managed." "I've never fired a shot in anger," Webb said quietly. "Nobody's born having done that," Cole replied. "The first time is the hardest. Every sniper I know has felt exactly what you're feeling right now. That moment before the first shot, when you understand that you're about to take a human life. It doesn't get easier, but it does become manageable." Webb finally looked at Cole. "What if I miss?" "Then you'll work your miss into your next shot. You'll adjust for wind, adjust for range, compensate for whatever variable threw off your first attempt. That's the job. Missing and correcting is part of the process. What matters is that you keep functioning, keep adjusting, keep trying until you hit." Cole spent the next hour with Webb going through various scenarios: engagement at different ranges, wind compensation for varying conditions, how to maintain focus and breathing when adrenaline threatened to overwhelm rational thought, how to use the spotter, in this case, Lieutenant Marcus, to verify target acquisition and adjust fire as needed. "Your scope is calibrated for 300 meters, Cole explained, pointing at the turrets. "Beyond that, you'll need to manually adjust. Do you know how to calculate MOA adjustments?" "Minutes of angle," Webb nodded. "I've calculated ballistics 1,000 times for maintenance purposes." "Then you're halfway there," Cole said. "The difference is that now you're not just calculating. You're implementing those calculations with actual shots that impact actual targets. The mental component is the hard part, not the technical component. After Cole left, Webb sat alone in the darkness, the rifle positioned at the firing port. He pulled out a notebook and began writing down calculations. Range, 820 meters to primary ridge. Wind, currently 8 knots northwest, gusting to 12. Temperature, dropping to approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit. These variables would affect bullet trajectory. A 7.62 x 51 NATO round would drop approximately 50 inches at 800 meters in calm conditions. With current wind, he'd need to adjust for drift. With temperature dropping, he'd need to account for slight changes in muzzle velocity. Webb calculated the MOA adjustments needed. He worked through the mathematics twice, then a third time, ensuring his computations were absolutely correct. Small errors in long-range ballistics compounded into significant misses. A half-minute error at 800 meters meant a miss by nearly 4 inches. At a human target, that might still be a hit. But what if the target was partially concealed? What if environmental factors created variables he hadn't anticipated? The mathematics helped, but it also increased his anxiety. There were so many variables, so many ways to miss, so many factors beyond his control. At 2200 hours, Webb lay back against the tower wall, the rifle across his chest. He didn't allow himself to sleep, but he did close his eyes. His mind replayed the day. The routine maintenance work, Rivera's arrival, the rush to prepare, the conversations with Cole. Somewhere out there, a wounded American soldier was lying in darkness, bleeding slowly, waiting for extraction that depended on a man who'd never fired a shot in combat. The responsibility of that reality pressed down on Webb like physical weight. He opened his eyes and looked at the rifle. The M40 was a weapon that had been designed and perfected over decades. It had seen service in conflicts across the globe. It had taken countless lives, not all of them in service of just causes, not all of them clear-cut moments of moral certainty. But right now, in Webb's hands, this weapon represented something simpler. It represented the only hope the rescue team had of survival. At 22:45 hours, Lieutenant Marcus returned with updated target information. Enemy movement had been detected on the ridge line. The rescue team would launch at 500 hours, dawn twilight, when visibility would be improving but darkness would still provide some concealment. Webb would have approximately 45 minutes of preparation time before the operation commenced. He loaded the magazine one final time, verifying each round's seating. He chambered a round, then carefully lowered the hammer to half-cock, the rifle now hot and ready. His hands were steady now. The doubt remained, but it had transformed from paralyzing fear into manageable anxiety, the kind that kept you sharp and focused rather than frozen. Webb positioned himself at the firing port, eye aligned with the scope, and began his wait for dawn. Somewhere in the darkness below, soldiers were checking gear, reviewing tactics, preparing for the moment when they would move into hostile territory, expecting that a rifle maintainer, a man who'd spent 7 years in the background, would keep them alive. Webb understood the weight of that expectation. He understood that his precision would determine whether mothers received phone calls notifying them of their sons' deaths. He understood that everything he'd prepared for, all the maintenance work, all the test firing, all the technical knowledge, came down to a single moment when he would have to make shots that mattered in ways nothing else in his life had ever mattered. He rested his eye against the scope and waited for dawn. The transition from night to dawn happened gradually, then suddenly. One moment, the world was shrouded in darkness visible only through the thermal signatures on Webb's scope. The next moment, the eastern horizon began to glow with the promise of sunlight. Webb had been motionless in the firing position for 3 hours, his body acclimating to the tower's concrete, his mind locked in a state of disciplined focus that bordered on meditative. At 4:45 hours, Lieutenant Marcus arrived with a thermos of coffee and the final intelligence brief. She settled beside Webb, her spotter's notebook open, binoculars around her neck. "Command just confirmed," she said quietly. "Rescue team is launching in 15 minutes. They'll move through the valley approach, staying in the brush as much as possible. When they get close to Delta's position, they'll be exposed for approximately 300 meters. That's when enemy response is most likely." Webb nodded, not looking away from his scope. The terrain below was becoming more visible as the pre-dawn light strengthened. He could see the ridge lines clearly now, the brush formations, the areas of concealment and exposure. He'd studied this landscape through maps and satellite imagery for hours, but seeing it with his own eyes through magnified optics made it real in a way that studying paper couldn't. "What's the status on the wounded sniper?" he asked. "Still breathing," Marcus said. "Still conscious. His spotter reports moderate blood loss from a lower leg wound. Tourniquet is applied and holding. They estimate he has maybe 2 hours before shock becomes critical." 2 hours. The rescue team's extraction would take time. They had to move cautiously, maintain security perimeter, get the wounded sniper mobile, and then traverse back to the base. 2 hours was a tight window, but it was workable if nothing went wrong. And everything was about to go wrong. The rescue team consisted of 12 soldiers, 8 security personnel, and 4 combat medics trained in tactical extraction. They moved out of Fob Falcon's southern gate at 500 hours precisely. Their movement caught on thermal imaging as they began their approach toward the compromised sniper team. Webb watched through his scope as they disappeared into the brush, their thermal signatures fading as they moved deeper into the terrain. The sun broke the horizon at 5:03 hours, flooding the landscape with golden morning light. Visibility improved dramatically. Webb could now see details, individual rock formations, specific brush densities, the paths that water would run during monsoon season. The ridge line where enemy forces were presumed to be positioned became clearly visible, a raised formation of earth and stone approximately 300 meters from where the rescue team would have to conduct their extraction. "Rescue team is in position," Marcus reported, speaking quietly into her radio. "They're approaching the sniper location. Estimated time to contact, 4 minutes." Webb's breathing remained steady and controlled. His hands were completely still now, the rifle absolutely motionless against his shoulder. He'd positioned himself perfectly, torso supported by sandbags, rifle stock secured, firing position optimized for extended observation. He could maintain this position indefinitely if necessary. He waited. The minutes stretched like hours. Webb's eyes remained fixed on the ridge line through the scope. He was looking for any movement, any sign of enemy preparation. Insurgent forces in this region used IEDs, ambush tactics, and coordinated small unit tactics to compensate for their lack of advanced weaponry. They would be watching the same area that Webb was watching. They would be waiting for the rescue team to become visible. At 5:07 hours, movement erupted on the ridge line. It started subtly, a shifting of brush, a change in shadow patterns. Then it became unmistakable. 3 enemy combatants rose from concealment approximately 840 meters from Webb's position. They were setting up what looked like a PKM machine gun on a tripod, positioning themselves to establish an ambush position on the rescue team. "Contact," Webb said quietly into his radio. 3 enemy combatants on the ridge establishing a machine gun position, approximately 840 meters. They're not engaging the rescue team yet. They're setting up for an ambush. "Roger that," Marcus responded. "Stand by. Rescue team is still approaching extraction point." Webb understood the tactical situation instantly. The enemy forces weren't reacting to the rescue team's presence yet. They were preparing to allow the rescue team to come into their engagement zone. Then they would initiate fire from a position of advantage. It was a smart tactic. Let your enemy commit to the engagement, then destroy them from a prepared position. But they didn't account for a rifleman in the tower who could see them setting up. Webb made minute adjustments to his scope, refining his point of aim on the enemy position, 840 meters. With the current wind, now down to approximately 6 knots as the sun warmed the earth, he would need to adjust for drift. Temperature had risen slightly, which would affect ballistic performance marginally. He calculated the required MOA adjustments, verifying his mathematics one final time. Rescue team is approaching final position, Marcus reported. They're going to be exposed in approximately 90 seconds. The rescue team would be vulnerable. They would be moving through open terrain toward the compromised sniper team, unable to effectively engage enemy positions while also conducting medical extraction. Their only hope was that enemy fire would be suppressed before the rescue team came fully into the kill zone. Webb's eye remained locked on the enemy position. The machine gunner was now fully exposed, positioning himself behind the weapon. Another combatant was loading ammunition. The third was establishing a security position approximately 20 meters to the side. This was the moment. This was the instant when Webb would have to transition from observer to warrior. Rescue team is now exposed, Marcus said, her voice carrying an edge of tension, moving toward Delta's position. Webb took a long, steady breath. He held it. His mind became completely clear, all doubt burning away in the crucible of necessity. He was no longer thinking about failure or doubt or the enormity of what he was doing. He was simply a tool, perfectly calibrated to perform a specific function. His finger moved to the trigger. The machine gunner below was raising himself slightly, preparing to begin his engagement. Webb could see the exact moment when the enemy combatant would open fire, the positioning of his body, the way his hands were moving toward the weapon controls, the shift in weight that preceded action. Webb's trigger finger increased pressure infinitesimally, the resistance building as the trigger mechanism prepared to release the firing pin. "Contact, enemy fire from the ridge," someone shouted over the radio. "We're taking effective fire. Sniper support needed now." Webb's world narrowed to the 3-inch circle visible through his scope. The rescue team was now pinned down, unable to advance without getting shredded by machine gun fire. The enemy combatant on the ridge was now fully engaged, his weapon pointing toward the rescue team position, death waiting in the form of high-velocity rounds. This was the moment Webb had been preparing for. This was why he'd spent the last 18 hours preparing, calculating, positioning himself. This was the moment that separated maintenance from execution. Webb completed his trigger squeeze. The trigger broke with the clean, precise resistance that Webb had come to expect from this weapon. The firing pin snapped forward with mechanical inevitability, striking the primer of the chambered round. The chemical reaction began instantly. Controlled explosion within the confines of the barrel, gases expanding at velocities that would reach supersonic speeds in milliseconds. The recoil drove the rifle back against Webb's shoulder with familiar force. The muzzle jump was minimal, the weapon was precisely balanced, the recoil management systems functioning exactly as designed. Webb had fired this rifle countless times during test sequences, but those previous shots had been academic exercises. This shot was different. This shot contained consequence. The 7.62 x 51 NATO round left the muzzle at approximately 2,750 feet per second, traveling downrange toward a target 840 meters distant. The bullet followed a ballistic arc that Webb had calculated precisely, accounting for wind drift, gravitational drop, temperature effects, and the spin imparted by the rifle's rifling. Every variable he'd considered, every calculation he'd performed, every hour of preparation now determined the round's trajectory. Through the scope, Webb watched the impact. The enemy machine gunner's head snapped backward with sudden violence. The round struck at approximately the temporal bone, high-velocity impact that didn't leave room for ambiguity about outcome. The combatant dropped instantly, his body going completely slack. He was dead before his consciousness could fully register that he'd been hit. "Target down," Webb reported, his voice steady despite the surge of adrenaline flooding his system. "Machine gunner neutralized." But the engagement wasn't over. The second combatant, the ammunition handler, immediately scrambled for the machine gun, attempting to take over the position. The weapon remained pointed at the rescue team. Webb was already working his bolt, chambering the next round. The mechanical action was automatic, his hands moving with the precision and speed born from thousands of maintenance cycles. Chamber the next round. Acquire sight picture. Calculate adjustment for the new target. The second enemy combatant was perhaps 50 meters from the first target, still exposed, still attempting to get behind the machine gun. Webb made a rapid adjustment to his scope, accounting for the slight wind shift and the slightly different range, and acquired his sight picture. His breathing remained controlled, his heart rate steady despite the external chaos. The radio crackled with urgent voices. "Second target acquiring the gun," someone shouted. "Sniper, we need suppressive fire." Webb was already executing. His finger found the trigger and the rifle spoke again. The second shot was traveling downrange even as the first body was still falling. The round caught the second combatant in the shoulder, a high-impact hit that spun him away from the machine gun position. He fell, screaming, his shoulder shattered by the impact. "Target wounded," Webb reported. "Weapon abandoned." The third combatant, the security position, immediately began returning fire toward the tower. Webb could hear the rounds impacting the concrete structure, bullets striking with violent force. One round passed so close that Webb heard it crack the air beside his head. But he didn't flinch. His attention remained laser-focused on the tactical situation unfolding below. The third enemy combatant was approximately 100 meters from the machine gun position, maintaining a security perimeter. Webb had to neutralize this threat before the rescue team would be safe enough to advance. The combatant was moving now, trying to get into a covered position while still maintaining sight lines on the rescue team. Webb worked his bolt again, chamber the round, acquire the target, calculate the distance, now closer, approximately 780 meters. The wind was still manageable. The sun angle was unchanged. He made minimal adjustments and squeezed the trigger. The third round downrange struck the combatant in the torso, a center mass hit that dropped him instantly. Webb's training had emphasized this. Eliminate threats, secure the area, then hold position and observe for secondary threats. The machine gun position was now completely abandoned. The immediate threat to the rescue team was neutralized. 3 targets down, Webb reported, his voice still controlled. Ridge position secure. Rescue team is clear to advance. There was a moment of stunned silence on the radio. Then Captain Rivera's voice came through, sharp and commanding. Confirm 3 enemy combatants neutralized. Confirmed, ma'am, Webb said. Machine gunner, ammunition handler, and security element. All 3 targets eliminated. Ridge position is currently undefended. Webb maintained his sight picture on the machine gun position, scanning the surrounding terrain for any additional enemy presence. His tactical training, basic as it was compared to dedicated snipers, told him to expect secondary or tertiary threats. Enemy forces in this region didn't typically operate with just 3 personnel. There would likely be reinforcements, secondary ambush positions, or additional fighters preparing to engage. But for the moment, the immediate threat was neutralized. Below, the rescue team began advancing toward the compromised sniper team's position. They moved cautiously, maintaining security posture, ready to engage if additional enemy fire erupted. Webb's eyes tracked their movement through the scope, still scanning for threats, still calculating distances and sight lines to potential enemy positions. The wounded sniper was visible now, a prone figure with a tourniquet applied to the lower leg, the wound visible even at this distance. The rescue team's medics immediately began working on him, assessing the injury, preparing him for movement. The combat medics moved with professional efficiency, the kind of practice coordination that only came from extensive training and real-world experience. Rescue team has visual on Delta, the team leader reported. Beginning medical assessment. Will be ready for movement in approximately 2 minutes. Webb continued his observation, still scanning for threats. His breathing had normalized now, the initial adrenaline spike beginning to fade, replaced by the cold clarity that came with successful execution. He'd made 3 shots in rapid succession, 3 shots that had transformed a lethal ambush into a neutralized threat. 3 human beings were now dead, because of decisions Webb had made and shots he had executed. The reality of that struck him suddenly like a physical blow. He just killed people. Whatever their alignment, whatever the justification, whatever the tactical necessity, he had ended 3 human lives with precision and deliberation. Webb understood intellectually that this was combat, that this was his job, that these actions had saved American lives. But emotionally, something in his psyche was registering the enormity of what he'd just done. He forced the thought aside. There would be time for processing later. Right now, the rescue team was still vulnerable and the operation wasn't complete. The second enemy combatant, the one Webb had wounded in the shoulder, was attempting to crawl away from the machine gun position. Webb tracked him through the scope, watching as the wounded combatant dragged himself toward some nearby brush, leaving a trail of blood. Webb could take another shot, could finish the wounded enemy, could ensure there were no survivors to provide intelligence to insurgent commanders. But something stopped him. The combatant was no longer a threat, not immediately, not to the rescue team. He was wounded, immobilized, unable to engage. Taking the additional shot felt different than the first 3. Those had been tactical necessities in a combat situation. This would be something else. Webb held his fire and continued observing. The rescue team secured the wounded sniper and began moving him onto a stretcher. The combat medics worked with practiced speed, establishing an IV line, checking the tourniquet, preparing the casualty for rapid movement. The entire rescue team established a defensive perimeter, weapons ready to engage any additional threats. Rescue team is mobile, the team leader reported. Moving back to extraction point. ETA to FOB Falcon, 12 minutes. Webb maintained overwatch as the rescue team began their withdrawal. He continued scanning the ridge lines, watching for any additional enemy movement. Minutes passed like hours. The rescue team moved deliberately but quickly, the medics carefully maneuvering the wounded sniper across rough terrain. At 5:21 hours, the rescue team crossed back into the perimeter security zone of FOB Falcon. The operation was complete. The wounded sniper was alive, critically injured but alive. And it was because of 3 shots made by a rifle maintainer who had become, for one critical moment, exactly what the situation had demanded. Webb finally lowered the rifle and allowed himself to breathe fully for the first time in hours. His hands were completely steady. His mind was clear. But somewhere deep in his consciousness, something had changed fundamentally. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Adrenaline didn't fade immediately. Webb remained in firing position for another 30 minutes after the rescue team secured the base perimeter, his attention never wavering from the ridge lines and surrounding terrain. Military discipline and training kept him locked in operational mode, even as his body screamed for rest, and his mind began processing the reality of what he'd done. At 5:51 hours, Lieutenant Marcus finally gave him clearance to stand down. Command says you're clear. Enemy forces have withdrawn from the engagement area. No secondary threats detected. Webb carefully unloaded the M40, removing the chambered round and setting it aside. He eased his body out of the firing position, muscles protesting after hours of absolute stillness. The sun was fully above the horizon now, casting long shadows across FOB Falcon. It was going to be a hot day, the kind of Afghan heat that made everything stick to your skin and made rational thought difficult. Webb descended the tower stairs slowly, the rifle cradled in his hands. The base seemed somehow different now, though nothing had physically changed. The same buildings stood in the same positions. The same personnel moved about their duties. But the base's internal dynamic had shifted, subtle but unmistakable. People were looking at him differently. He first noticed it when he reached the armory. Private Jackson was waiting at the entrance, his expression a mixture of awe and something that might have been fear. Sergeant Webb, that was, we heard about it. 3 targets. That was incredible. Webb set the rifle down on the workbench, not answering. He began the process of cleaning the weapon, removing the fouling that had accumulated during the firing sequence. The familiar ritual helped ground him, gave his hands something to do while his mind struggled with the enormity of what had occurred. Word had spread through the base like wildfire. The rifle maintainer had stopped a lethal ambush. The quiet man from the armory had become the focus of the entire base's awareness. Webb could hear soldiers talking about it as they passed the armory, whispered conversations, comments of respect and amazement. At 6:30 hours, Captain Rivera arrived at the armory. She saluted him formally, the kind of respectful gesture that soldiers only offered to those they held in high regard. "Sergeant Webb, I wanted to thank you personally. You saved that entire rescue team. You probably saved Sniper Delta's life as well." "Just doing my job, Captain," Webb said quietly, not looking up from the rifle he was cleaning. "No," Rivera said firmly. "You went above and beyond what anyone could have asked. I'm recommending you for a commendation, Medal of Heroism, pending command approval." Webb finally looked at her. "Ma'am, I was just maintaining a weapon and following orders." Rivera's expression was firm. "You were much more than that, and you know it. Those weren't shots fired on a range. Those were combat kills executed under pressure in a real tactical situation. That takes a specific kind of courage and discipline." After Rivera left, Webb sat alone in the armory for a long time. The weight of her words settled on his shoulders. Combat kills. The terminology was clinical, professional, but it didn't change the fundamental reality. He had taken human lives. Whatever the justification, and the justification was clear, the rescue team would have been slaughtered without his intervention. The outcome remained. 3 people were dead because of decisions he'd made. The wounded sniper arrived at the field hospital just as the morning shift was beginning. Webb learned this from the medical staff when they came through the armory requesting rifle cleaning supplies. The sniper, Sergeant First Class Derek Hansen, had suffered a compound fracture of the tibia and significant blood loss, but he would recover. The tourniquet had held. The rescue team's speed had been sufficient. The extraction had worked. And it had worked because Webb had made 3 shots that eliminated the immediate threat. At 800 hours, the base commander, Major Harrison, convened an official after-action briefing. Command wanted a detailed accounting of the engagement. Webb was summoned to the operations center, something that had never happened before. Usually, intelligence briefings were conducted without the armory staff present. He found himself seated at a table with Captain Rivera, Lieutenant Marcus, the rescue team leader, and various command personnel. Major Harrison sat at the head of the table, his expression serious. "Sergeant Webb," Harrison said, "I want to commend you on your performance during the rescue operation. Your actions directly resulted in the success of the mission. However, I need to understand your mindset and decision-making process during the engagement. Can you walk us through your shots?" Webb took a breath and began explaining. The first target, the machine gunner, had been an immediate threat to the rescue team. The engagement would have been initiated against personnel who were actively establishing a lethal ambush. The second target was similar, attempting to continue the ambush by taking over the machine gun position. The third target was the security element, a combatant who could have engaged the rescue team from secondary position. "And the wounded combatant you chose not to engage?" Harrison asked. "The one who crawled away from the machine gun position?" Webb hesitated. He was no longer a direct threat to the rescue team, sir. He was immobilized by wounds. Engaging him seemed to violate the principle of proportional response. Even though he could have provided intelligence to enemy forces, someone asked. Yes, sir, Webb said quietly. But I made a judgment call based on the tactical situation at that specific moment. The rescue team was no longer in immediate danger from that combatant. Harrison nodded slowly. Your judgment was sound, Sergeant. In fact, it demonstrates something important. You weren't just reacting to threats. You were thinking tactically about the broader situation. That's commendable. The briefing lasted 2 hours. Webb was asked dozens of questions about wind conditions, distance calculations, target identification, threat assessment. He answered each one with professional precision, explaining his methodology and reasoning. By the end, it was clear that his actions had been not just effective, but tactically intelligent. As he was leaving the operations center, Staff Sergeant Cole approached him. I heard you were phenomenal out there, Cole said. 3 shots, 3 targets neutralized. That's professional-level marksmanship, Webb. I was just doing what was necessary, Webb replied. That's what professionals say, Cole responded. Look, I've got authority to recommend personnel for sniper training. You interested? With your knowledge of weapons and your demonstrated capability under pressure, you could be an outstanding sniper. Webb considered the offer, a promotion, recognition, a pathway to advancement that had never been available to him in his previous role as a maintainer, but something in his chest recoiled from the idea. I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'm a maintainer. That's what I do. Cole looked surprised. You just demonstrated you're capable of being much more than a maintainer. Maybe, Webb said, but those 3 shots, they were born out of necessity, not choice. I did what was needed because people were dying. That doesn't mean I want to make it my career. That afternoon, the base commander released an official commendation. Sergeant Marcus Webb had been awarded the Army Commendation Medal with valor for his actions during the rescue operation. The commendation was read aloud during the evening formation, in front of the entire base. For the first time in his military career, Webb was the center of attention. When he returned to the armory after the formation, he found something waiting for him. The wounded sniper, Sergeant First Class Derek Hansen, was there, sitting in a wheelchair, his left leg elevated in a cast. Hansen's face was pale from blood loss and pain medication, but his eyes were sharp and grateful. You're Webb, Hansen said. It wasn't a question. Yes, sir, Webb replied. I wanted to thank you in person, Hansen said. Rivera told me what happened. You made those shots when I was lying out there bleeding. Those shots were the only thing that kept my extraction team alive. Webb nodded slowly. I'm just glad you made it. I wouldn't have without you, Hansen said. I don't know if you understand how rare it is to find someone who can make that kind of shot under that kind of pressure. You're special, Webb. Whatever you decide to do with that ability, know that you saved lives today. After Hansen left, Webb sat alone in the armory. He picked up the M40, the weapon he'd used to take 3 lives and save 4. The rifle felt different in his hands now, not just a tool for maintenance anymore, not just a weapon for test firing. It was an instrument of consequence, a machine that had become an extension of human choice and human responsibility. He began the meticulous process of deep cleaning and maintenance, knowing that tomorrow, more soldiers would come to collect weapons from the armory. They would take rifles that Webb had maintained. Those rifles would be used for purposes he would never fully know. And now, Webb understood that his maintenance work wasn't just about mechanical precision. It was about something deeper, about enabling other people to accomplish their missions, to stay alive, to complete their objectives. The invisible work of the background soldier had become visible, and Webb wasn't sure how he felt about that visibility. 3 weeks after the rescue operation, Sergeant Marcus Webb found himself back in the armory, doing exactly what he'd been doing before everything changed. The routine was comforting in its familiarity, field stripping rifles, replacing worn components, verifying ballistic specifications. But the context had shifted entirely. The work that had once felt invisible now carried weight and meaning that it hadn't possessed before. The first indication of the change came from the soldiers themselves. When they came to collect weapons, they no longer made small talk about the weather or upcoming leave schedules. Instead, they thanked him. They asked him questions about their rifle's capabilities. They paid attention to his advice about maintenance and care in ways they hadn't before. "How does this carbine perform at extended range?" a young private asked, picking up an M4 variant that Webb had just completed maintenance on. "That particular weapon will group well to 500 meters if you're trained properly," Webb replied. "The rail system is optimized for tactical optics. I'd recommend a quality scope if you're planning extended range work." The private listened intently, taking notes. This was a conversation that had happened 1,000 times before, Webb providing technical information to soldiers who would then use his recommendations in the field. But now, that information carried different weight. The private understood that the man giving him this information was someone who had made combat shots at extreme range. The sniper team that had been rotating in finally arrived at Fob Falcon. They were a 4-person element, 2 designated marksmen and 2 snipers, led by a staff sergeant named Rodriguez who had substantial combat experience. Rodriguez came to the armory specifically to meet Webb. "I heard you're the person who maintained the weapon used in the Ridge operation," Rodriguez said by way of introduction. "That was some impressive shooting." "Thank you," Webb replied. "The weapon was well maintained and performed exactly as designed." Rodriguez smiled slightly. "That's a polite way of saying you knew the rifle well enough to compensate for ballistic variables that would have thrown off a less experienced shooter. Cole told me about your technical knowledge. I'd like you to work with our team. Maintain our weapons, yes, but also consult on ballistic calculations and equipment optimization." This was precisely what Webb had hoped wouldn't happen, a formal integration into the combat operations structure. But as Rodriguez explained the scope of the role, Webb found himself actually considering it. Working with dedicated snipers would mean elevating his technical knowledge from theoretical to practical. It would mean understanding weapons not just as mechanical systems, but as tools designed for specific combat applications. "I'll do it," Webb said. "On one condition, I maintain my primary role in the armory. I don't transition to sniper support full-time." "That works for us," Rodriguez agreed. "We need someone who understands both the mechanics and the applications. You're the perfect fit for that role." Over the next week, Webb found himself developing a routine that blended his traditional armory work with new consulting responsibilities. He analyzed ballistic data with Rodriguez's team. He calibrated scopes and verified zero coordinates. He reviewed equipment maintenance protocols and suggested improvements based on field experience. It was fulfilling work that utilized his technical knowledge in new and meaningful ways. The wounded sniper, Sergeant First Class Hansen, was transferred to a larger medical facility for recovery and rehabilitation. But before he left Fob Falcon, he came to the armory one final time. He was still in a wheelchair, his legs still in a full-length cast, but he was mobile and his color had improved significantly. "I wanted to give you something," Hansen said, handing Webb a photograph. It showed Hansen and Webb standing together, both in full combat kit, taken during a bittersweet moment at the base. "That's for you, something to remember that what you did mattered." Webb took the photograph and nodded slowly. "How's the recovery going?" "Long road ahead," Hansen admitted. "Doctors are saying I might recover enough for limited duty, but full sniper work is probably behind me. But I'm alive, thanks to you. My family gets to have me around, even if I'm not quite the same anymore." That evening, Webb sat alone in the armory and looked at the photograph. In the image, he and Hansen were smiling, genuine smiles that reflected the bond formed through shared danger and mutual survival. Webb had never thought of himself as someone who formed meaningful connections quickly, but there was undeniable truth in the fact that this man's life existed because of decisions Webb had made under pressure. The Medal of Heroism recommendation had moved through command channels. At the next formal ceremony, Major Harrison presented Webb with the commendation in front of the entire base. Webb accepted it with professional dignity, understanding that the medal represented more than his own actions. It represented the recognition that background soldiers, the support personnel, the maintainers and technical specialists were integral to combat operation success. In the weeks following the ceremony, Webb received several requests for interviews with military journalists covering the rescue operation. He declined all of them. The story, he believed, wasn't about him. It was about the wounded sniper who had maintained his position despite critical injury. It was about the rescue team who had moved into hostile territory with perfect trust that support would be provided. It was about the system of maintenance and preparation that allowed an ordinary soldier to perform extraordinary actions when necessity demanded. But privately, Webb understood that something fundamental had changed within him. He now maintained weapons with a different perspective. Every rifle that left the armory carried the potential for impact, both negative and positive. Every maintenance decision he made had consequences that rippled far beyond the mechanics of the weapon itself. One afternoon, a young private came to the armory to pick up a repaired M4. The soldier was nervous, clearly anxious about something. "Something wrong?" Webb asked. "I'm deploying on a patrol tomorrow," the private admitted. "I'm worried about my weapon. I want to make sure it's going to work when I need it." Webb set down his work and gave the private his full attention. "That weapon has been thoroughly maintained and test-fired. Every component is functioning within specifications. You can trust it completely." "How can you be sure?" the private asked. Webb considered the question carefully. "Because I understand every part of that rifle. I know its capabilities and its limitations. I've verified its function personally. When you carry that weapon, you're carrying something I've guaranteed with my expertise." The private nodded, some of his anxiety visibly easing. He left the armory carrying the rifle with renewed confidence. That evening, Webb sat at his workbench and reflected on how much had changed in 3 weeks. He was no longer invisible. Soldiers acknowledged him when they passed. Command valued his input on technical matters. He had been commended for heroism and had received a medal that would stay in his personnel file for the rest of his career. But more importantly, he had learned something about the nature of his work. Maintenance and support weren't background functions. They were foundational elements of combat capability. Every rifle maintained properly, every weapon verified for reliability, every technical consultation provided. These were acts of care that enabled other soldiers to accomplish their missions and return home alive. He picked up the photograph of himself and Hansen and studied it once more. In the image, they were 2 soldiers who had been brought together by circumstance and necessity. One had faced death. The other had made the decisions that prevented that death. But the connection between them ran deeper than that single moment. It represented the fundamental interdependence of all soldiers, regardless of their role. At 2100 hours, Webb locked up the armory and walked back to his quarters. Above him, the Afghan sky was filled with stars, brilliant and indifferent to human struggles occurring below. Webb thought about his daughter, Sarah. He would call her this weekend if communications allowed. He would tell her about his medal, though he wouldn't mention the actual details of how he'd earned it. She was 15 now, probably more interested in her own life than in her father's military service. But maybe, someday, she would understand what he did and why it mattered. The next morning, Webb returned to the armory and found it waiting for him. The same space he'd occupied for months, now transformed by the knowledge of what those weapons in those racks could do when wielded with precision and purpose. He began his work again, methodically maintaining each rifle, verifying each weapon, ensuring each tool was ready for the soldiers who would depend on it. The extraordinary moment had passed. The rescue operation had faded into the stream of ongoing base operations. But Webb understood now that every day in the armory contained its own kind of heroism, the quiet, consistent work of a man who understood that his maintenance kept soldiers alive. He ran a cloth along the barrel of an M16, cleaning away the light fouling that had accumulated. The work was repetitive, seemingly mundane, but Webb understood now what it truly represented, the foundation of everything that happened in combat, the invisible work that made visible heroism possible. Sergeant Marcus Webb had learned that being in the background didn't mean being unimportant. Sometimes, the most crucial role was the one nobody noticed, until it suddenly made all the difference between life and death. And now, he maintained his weapons knowing exactly what they meant.